Racism emerges really in the 16th and 17th, particularly the 17th century. Europeans were enslaving and had for some centuries been enslaving people both of Africa and of the New World.
The history of racism in the Western world is broadly associated with slavery as the early form of colonialism. And it's in that context that something called race is created, which essentially means that certain people who are defined as non-Europeans find themselves ruled and governed by Europeans.
For people in America in the 17th and the 18th century, race was a fact of life. And I think that racism is something that comes out of that interaction of necessity. This isn't people cooking up racism in their laboratory or in their study and then going out into the world to apply it. In a sense, white people, and blacks and Indians, worked out their ideas of race in proximity with each other on the hoof.
The British don't become slave traders and slavers because they are racist. They become racist because they use slaves for great profit in the Americas and devise a set of attitudes towards black people that justifies what they've done. The real engine behind the slave system is economics. Africans are items of trade. They're things that are bought, that are sold, that are bequeathed, that are inherited. They're like other items of trade. And once you've got that established, both on the slave ships, of which there are thousands leaving British ports, and once you've got that established on the plantations, and once you've got that established as a basis for expanding British wealth, how can you argue that somehow or other the great inferiority of black people isn't built into fundamental cultural values of the British?
John Hawkins was perhaps the first English trader to actually kidnap slaves from Tagrin, which is a couple of miles from Freetown, and forcibly took slaves away from Sierra Leone. The sad thing is that this man was even made a knight. When we were in school, we read about Sir John Hawkins as if he was such a good person, he was such a righteous person, somebody who had contributed positively to, the creation of the British Empire. It was only much later that some of us learned with regret that, in fact, he was not only involved in the slave trade, but he actually captured, slaves.
He established places down down by Government Wharf, what we call Government Wharf now.
Over time it became an industry, and a lot of English traders and a lot of Sierra Leonean rulers, particularly those along the coast, became heavily involved in the slave trade. And we have, for instance, several islands off the coast of Sierra Leone that were prominent slave trading posts, like Bonds Island, for instance, where there were English forts, other European South forts, even Americans were very heavily involved in the slave trade from Bonds Island.
We say that come for buy. The number there, in a group iron, the number we want, you take up. He put on this fire room, open, a banana, Nasudara.
And of course, we know the way they were taken, captured, tied up, chained, and thrown into the ships.
So it was a very bad experience for the slaves from the moment they were captured up to the time they reached the so-called New World.
And then those who survived and did arrive, had to be put for sale. And then when they were bought, they had to undergo all kinds of indignities.
One great woman, it could cost 2 man price. Sometimes they work for you, not the garden. Not come back, they work for you, they born picking for you. Now for that, they pay 2 times for one great woman. When the boat come collect tuna, go.
At a conservative estimate, over 11 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. Manacled and packed together like animals, at least 2 million died during the infernal voyage known as the Middle Passage.
Slaves are seen as deracinated people, people who did not belong, who were natally alienated. That is, they had no right of birth, and they're seen as people who had been torn from another society but not socialized into the new one. So they were socially dead, so to speak. They were seen as people without honor, which is a degraded condition. The value of this for the master is that the master had absolute power over the slave, regardless of what the laws may say. They had rights of life and death.
A situation grows up where thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these black or dark-skinned people are being kept down without rights and kept at work night and day by a system of surveillance with whips and cutlasses. And of course there is the fear that they will try and rise up, that they'll try to run away, and that when they do that they're going to slaughter the masters and the overseers and their wives in their beds, and really that any white person will be seen as a potential enemy by the blacks. And so you get this mutual fear between the two groups, and this tends to consolidate racial feeling. And the only way to keep these slave societies even minimally secure was to arm all the white men, and even indeed some of the white women too.
So you're there in your plantation manor, you're there in your settler outpost. What are the natives doing? Sort of classic line, from these movies. The natives are restless. What's going on? Those drums in the background. There's the idea that these people are sort of getting together and they're going to invade us, they're going to attack us. And it's a kind of projection basically. In other words, you've invaded their countries, you've subordinated them. There's a long history of colored perils. There's the red peril called Red Indians. There's the yellow peril, there's the black peril. There's this idea of the non-white other. And the non-white other is threatening, the non-white other is scary, the non-white other may be coming to attack. And it comes out of, you could say, a bad conscience in part, a sort of subconscious recognition perhaps of the kind of things that have been done to the non-white other.
In the early 16th century, from Chile in the south to Florida in the north, this non-white other was no more than vermin to be exterminated. The Dominican monk Bartolomé de las Casas was eyewitness to countless atrocities against the native populations. His account reads like a catalogue of genocide.
The mainland and the region known as Florida. The Spaniards murdered many, as is their custom, in order to strike terror into the heart of these people. They made their lives an utter misery, treating them as so many beasts of burden. In another large town, the butchers put the whole town to the sword, young and old, chiefs and commoners, not even the children were spared. The butcher-in-chief arranged for a large number of natives in the area to have their noses, lips and chins sliced from their faces. They were then sent away in unspeakable agony and all running with blood, to act as walking testimony to the great deeds and holy miracles performed by these dauntless missionaries of the Holy Catholic faith.
The things that Las Casas witnessed, particularly on Hispaniola or in Cuba, these incredible crimes, these incredible attacks on Indians, disembowelings and burnings and rapes and whatever else, I'm sure that that level of violence is something that you could have witnessed in different places in the 17th, the 18th century, in other parts of the Spanish Empire. But it was a peculiarly awful moment that Las Casas saw as the Spanish got to the Americas and tried literally to work the Indians to death.
The reports of Las Casas caused enough unease for the Council of the Indies, the Spanish administrators of the New World, to call a debate at Valladolid in Spain in 1550. The debate concerned not just the mistreatment of Indians, but whether they could be categorized as human at all. In contest with Las Casas, the champion of the native populations, was the Jesuit Juan Ginés de Sepulveda.
By this time, the Spanish have been in the Americas for about 50 years. And during that time, the brutalities carried out by the conquistadors had reached such heights that it caused some alarm. And out of that context came this particular debate. On the one hand, there was this idea that the Indians had souls, they could be Christianized, and they should be treated not as servants, not as forced laborers, but as people under the protectorate of the Spanish. On the other side of the debate was the idea that perhaps these are not people with souls, perhaps these are people who are natural slaves. And in that context, they could be coerced to produce labor.
What Las Casas wanted to do was to change the policy of the Spanish crown towards the Indians. So paradoxically, he was able to get slavery of Indians banned. That's something which the Spanish crown bans, outlaws, and by 1542 the laws have been changed to ensure that there can no longer be Indian slaves. But Las Casas also suggests that the labor shortfall in America can be made up with black slaves from Africa, which I think he later regretted, later in life.
It's a key moment insofar as the reflection on the system that produces race is there in that debate. The system that produces race, which will produce race over the next 200-300 years, is that colonial system, which takes this diverse range of peoples and defines them as Indian, forces that category on them. And it's in that context that you begin to see two things that go hand in hand with the development of racism. On the one hand, the institutions that keep in place exploited populations, oppressed populations, and in that context, the debates that then take place as to what kinds of populations they are. These debates begin with lawyers, they move to anthropologists, and then they move on to biologists, always debating within that context of colonialism, which fixes those people as objects of investigation.
Thursday, 11th October. Thus far and no land. Another 12 hours will decide.
A crucial moment in the racial history of the whole Atlantic world and of the world is Christopher Columbus, but not the first voyage, which everybody knows about, but the third voyage in 1498. Columbus sailed south to Sierra Leone, where, as he noticed, the people are very black, perfectly black. And then he sailed due west from Sierra Leone, and he wound up near Trinidad and the northern coast of South America. And he reported that the people there were white with blonde hair. And that shouldn't have happened according to the prevailing theories of skin color in the whole classical world in the medieval period. What happened with Columbus is that people started to realize that you could stay on the same latitude and get radically different skin colors. And if that was the case, then there had to be some other explanation for skin color other than geography. So that's where you begin to get the emergence of biological theories of difference in skin color. And that leads eventually to racist theories of differences in skin color.
And so a view emerges, originally identified as pre-Adamism, that maybe there are multiple origins, and that less civilized, more primitive human beings have an origin that is not accountable for by a biblical narrative, but are closer to the animal world. And that view then develops into a view called polygenism, that is multiple origins.
When Europeans first encountered chimpanzees, they were really struck by the similarities between what we now call chimpanzees and humans. But they called chimpanzees drills. And one of the questions that John Locke talks about in his essay concerning human understanding is the question of whether human beings have mated with drills. So the question that gets increasingly asked in the 17th century is, are African peoples what we would call the same species as Europeans? And Locke has real questions about whether we can say that they're the same species or not. And one of the explanations for African people that you start hearing in Barbados, for instance, the English colony on Barbados in the 17th century, is that black Africans are produced by the sexual union of a chimpanzee and a human being. So they're not really human, they're half animal. And this gets bound up with a whole series of prejudices about the animality of Africans, their bestiality, their sexuality is animalistic. Even in the 20th century, you get all sorts of claims about jazz music being animalistic. These are prejudices that begin to be ingrained in European culture in the 17th century in the context of what we think of as major scientific or philosophical texts.